All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you for returning so expediently from the break. I think you're really going to get a kick out of this next discussion. I know I already am, and we haven't even started yet. Again, my name is Alberto Olivas with Arizona State University, the Congressman Ed Pastor Center for Politics and Public Service. In a minute, you're going to hear from our guests, Indra Arriaga and Dr. Charles Waukee, sitting here to my left. Before we do, though, we'd like to show you a very brief video to kind of bring home the nature of what we've been talking about all day. So if we can go ahead and show that video, let's go ahead and turn our attention to the screens.
Action.
We need somebody to press play. There we go.
Tavakamengunga rena kanets komalo kuchuchuklittunga chuchukliyagalirtut challiut awangnaklukinaguutait qanriagat chuchuklifkarilutunglu chuchuklirnaraqan mumiktistikariuguvat mumiktituulat qiurlenang narluunalkutalagat ikaayuriumatgun
Divisions of Elections Army chuchukliriaraalirtut artaqakluku taalilarnut ikaayunarqillriit chuchuklillerkaitnun yuungarifkallerkaitnun tamaatumnalluunaisaarutti computeraatun paqtukungaatnurani www.elections.alaska.gov.
And thank you to Indra for providing that video with us. Earlier today, I greeted you with Kuali Tlanesi, which is good morning in the Aztec language Nahuatl. Right now, I would say Kuali Tonali, which is good afternoon. And I invite my guests to also greet you in their languages. As I introduce them, first off to my left, your right, Dr. Charles Waukee is an associate professor at University of Alaska Fairbanks. He's an applied linguist, which is a field I have a great affinity for, and specializes in second language acquisition. Dr. Waukee is such a treasure in his state. I really feel like he should have armed guards escorting him around. He's been fundamental in the effort to revitalize and preserve the Yupik language and promote it among college students in Alaska so that it is maintained and strengthened over time. And he is someone that is seen as a resource among elections workers to help guide them and inform them in their efforts to make sure that materials and strategies are effective and appropriate for the Yupik communities that he works with. And we'll get into this, as valuable as his subject matter expertise is, are his relationships with those communities, and we'll talk about that in a minute. And we also are lucky to have Indra Arriaga with us as well. She is Elections a Language Assistant Compliance Manager for the State of Alaska Division of Elections, originally from Mexico. She is an amazing linguist herself and a researcher, and has also been fundamental in helping to create and develop resources, strategies, and policies and practices that work and are very effective at engaging communities that up to now have been largely left out of these efforts. So let me ask each of them in turn, starting with Indra, if you would please greet us and give us your initial thoughts about what should all of us be keeping in mind as we develop strategies to provide resources that will work and will be effective for language minorities.
Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for having me. Do you want me to respond in Spanish the whole thing?
Yes, not just the greeting.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Can you repeat the question?
What advice do you have for organizations, community advocacy organizations, as much as elections workers that are just getting into the work of developing strategies for language access support for language minorities?
I think that, the first and foremost thing that I would recommend is to really approach any relationship building opportunity with really an open mind and be ready to listen. And it's not until you can really listen and put yourself in other people's shoes that you can really understand what the needs are. And even then, you can't ever really know. So you have to keep nurturing those relationships and continuing to talk to folks. I mean, we did a lot in 2016 to establish our program, but it wasn't a one-time thing. I mean, it continues every single week, every single day. So I think that really just approaching the communities, whatever communities they may be, with that openness is the first thing you have to do.
Thank you. Dr. Walker.
Amsatut Goya Vikahkanka Yud Jalishit Manna Koyochtput Biochtsteed David Daxu Ingna Indra Shu Ichiwak Ayagaula Mavatais Komala Dauguk Magutlu Ilaput Mantritamapji Ilakluji Goya Wiksugamti Manna Biochtluku Goyana David Jaknak. I just want to take a moment to thank David emailing Indra and asking about me to partake in this humbling opportunity to share about giving people voice and choice. And for everybody else who's made this possible, I want to take this opportunity to thank them for inviting me.
Thank you both. And I'm glad we started in this way with the video and with each of us saying a few remarks in our languages. One of the reasons I wanted to do that was to help us to re-examine what are our psychological models when we're talking about providing language assistance. Because I think all too often it might be easy to fall into the trap of thinking of other languages that people speak where they need language access assistance as problems to be solved or as challenges to be overcome. And so I think seeing this beautiful video and hearing from people like Indra and Walkie speak in their own language, I think is a good and important reminder to us that these languages that exist in our communities are assets. They're treasures, they're resources that we should celebrate, as opposed to seeing them as problems to be fixed. And so to the extent that we have these kinds of video and audio materials presented to voters in their own languages, it is beautiful to the people that speak those languages. It encourages them to see the elections as their own, as something that belongs to them, that they are a part of, as opposed to something that has to be done for them because it is required. So this discussion, it's maybe going to be a challenging one I think and hope will be thought-provoking. But in our lead-up conversations, we've shared so many really fun and moving stories about the work of developing the relationships with communities that is necessary to do this effectively. Because it's not just the technical aspects of translating and providing information resources. All of that will only have any impact if it's based on a foundational relationship between the election jurisdiction and the community that is being served and partnered with. So I want to start maybe with Dr. Charles with Waukee. If you can tell us a little bit about what you've learned in your experience about how to create and maintain a trust-based relationship between communities that sometimes have a troubled history with the government or with the jurisdiction that is running the elections. What is necessary in order for there to be the kind of trust and understanding that makes for a good, effective partnership?
My father, who died 23 years ago, would say many times, and I never knew what he meant as I was growing up, when we've taken the opportunity to listen and we've taken the opportunity to observe, then we too might have a story to tell. And as I grew older, I learned that it takes, and I applaud Indra for coming as an Ashanak, as a guest into Alaska to help accommodate this voting process without knowing anything about the Yupik people or the Alaska Native people. But what I see is an example of what my father would say, taking the time to listen to people's stories and to observe how people do things, and gaining that access into that culture in which making choices becomes a reality. But it has to start somewhere, and Indra and your people, my brothers and sisters with whom you work, have made this possible. But we needed somebody who we trusted to make that happen. And Indra and people like Indra, and there's many of you in this room, otherwise this room would be empty. You've gained that access and membership into that culture, which you're giving people that choice to vote. And so I think one of the things is, gaining access, and how do we gain that access, and how do we listen, and how do we observe, because there's so many things to seek and make sense of before we find that common ground by which to make sense of of the choices that we want to make for our future.
So one of the things I hear from that is the need to come in as someone that expects to learn, as opposed to someone that's coming in with the answers and the solutions. So coming in with a student's kind of mindset, asking for guidance, which is the exact opposite of how I got started doing voter outreach. I was when Walkie shared that story previously, I told him about a humiliating story for me when I was a fresh new voter outreach worker, the voter outreach director for our Secretary of State in Arizona, and got sent to the Navajo Nation for the first time. I'd never been on Navajo before, and nobody told me what to expect, and I went dressed entirely wrong. And I didn't have any cultural knowledge to guide me, and so I ended up doing exactly everything wrong. Everything I should do to make people not trust me and not open up to me. And I couldn't figure out why no one would talk to me. So afterwards I spoke with some other people who educated me about all of the cultural things I had, the cultural norms I had violated. And that was a good learning experience for me, but the main lesson I took from that was, if you're going to work in a community that you don't know, you need to find a trusted guide, someone that can give you advice, someone that can really give it to you straight and tell you what you know and what you don't know and what questions you need to ask. And so for Indra, I'm very curious, you're from Mexico, you ended up right now in Alaska working with indigenous communities there. How do you determine who to partner with and who to trust and who can help give you guidance and support? How do you navigate becoming known and trusted in a community that is a new one for you?
Well, first of all, it's a real honor to work in Alaska and to work with Alaska Native communities, and it's really humbling, actually. But one of the things that I rely on is my own experience. I mean, not that I have a ton of it, but I come from people who do, right? I mean, my grandmother was a Black indigenous Mexican who didn't know how to read and write. Right? I mean, she would sign things with either her thumbprint or a cross. And those experiences like that instill values that are shared, with communities that require language assistance, right? Because everybody has a similar experience, especially, post-colonial times, and, and systemic issues that we've had in voting disenfranchisement, particularly in Alaska, over the past 30, 40 years. And so pulling from those resources in simple terms, in terms of like approaching a community and just being open and knowing that we have something in common. And I think people can sense that. I mean, you usually know when someone's, talking too much or trying to do something that you don't quite agree with, and so really just being open to that. I also I didn't do it alone, right? I mean, I didn't come into this job and suddenly I did it. It came as a result of litigation, not one litigation but two. It's a result of something's already being in place, within the Division of Elections. We already had a language program. I didn't invent the language program. Right, so I was following some best practices and changing things that didn't seem to be working very well, and really being open to suggestions from the people that I was approaching, and so it came down to just sitting back and and allowing people to voice their thoughts and let them tell me how things worked for them. You know, my UPIC panel, I call them my panels because I do feel some sort of ownership, and you know, in the process, because they've become family, they've become friends, and my UPIC panel carries on a translation process very different than my Gwich'in panel, you know, and very different than my Inupiaq panel. And so understanding those little nuances, you know, between the Alaska Native cultures and what they're telling me is really fundamental to being able to carry on the work.
That's great. In some of our prior calls, you both have shared stories that related to tapping into cultural knowledge and traditions and norms of communities as a way of finding new ways to explain what is going on with the elections process. Do any stories come to mind that you would like to share right now about ways that you've found to access and leverage cultural knowledge, stories, traditions as a way to gain entry into these communities and to help figure out effective ways to translate and communicate across those linguistic and cultural divisions?
I'm gonna think about this for a while.
Mm-hmm.
That's a really big question. There are a lot of stories. You know, there are stories that manifest in the smallest of things, and then there are other stories that are really much bigger. You know, in learning a little bit about the different cultures and how they work and you know what is important to them. For example, in the word candidate, you know, when we translated it into UPIC, so in the process, you know, we talk about the concepts. You know, they come up with a word or a sentence or a concept that explains candidate, for example. In UPIC, it means, and correct me if I'm wrong, someone who wants you to choose them to do something. But in Inupiaq, it translates into someone who you choose because they think like you. And fundamentally, those are two very different approaches to voting. And so just keeping things like that in mind, I think are really, really important.
Well, Walkie, you had mentioned before about an experience of younger poll workers seeking to assist elders, and that there's an appropriate way to do that, and then there's a not good way to do that with regards to wondering, asking about, you know, inviting them to answer a question as opposed to asking them if they need help.
Well, let me preface that first by traditionally our responsibility as Kingulet, which is the younger generation, is to take heed of all the words and practices of our Jiulet, or our elders. At the same time, it is our UPIC right to make certain that our Jiulet have access and full understanding of the new ways of living in our land, shared with Aibitefoot, which is the Americans, and their ways of regulating their ways. They ought to resonate peacefully and logistically in order to make greater sense of our two worlds under which we live as Americans. And so I have to keep in mind when I speak with those elders who taught me the language, and my parents who taught me the language. They're the ones who gave me that life by which to express myself from the soul. And so when we guide them into the polling stations, I need to still regard them as such. And so I need to create that language of respect as I lead them into the choices they need to make as citizens of America. And so one way that I do it is in the UPIC way, and this is what I tell my students at the university where I teach. And UPIC is the only language right now that has a bachelor's degree program in the world. And so for that, we're fortunate that we have that opportunity. So what my students learn when they work with elders or get information from elders is to say, I wonder. I wonder how you could tell the story about. I wonder why. A long time ago, people used to blank. I wonder how many times such and such. And so that way, there's, even though you're asking the question, they're still in charge because they're my elders. They're the ones who need, who will provide me the story I want, but do it in that respectful way.
Thank you. Another topic that we've touched on in our lead-up calls for today's session is about creating a pipeline. How do we ensure that the important work that people like Indra and Walkie are involved in will continue? How do we recruit and identify young members of these communities to these fields of work, to work in elections, to work in linguistic research, to be the ones developing the kinds of relationships that are bridge builders between cultural and community institutions and elections officials? What have you learned, or what examples can you give of effective ways to identify, mentor, and prepare young members of these communities to do these kinds of jobs?
Well, I think it's really important to recognize that the languages are living languages and our cultures are living cultures, and so they're going to change. And the languages change, the cultures change, the laws change, and we have to really be open and stay on top of all these changes. And we had something that happened with my Inupiaq panel. So we have an Inupiaq panel, and right now we're working with 2 dialects of Inupiaq. Ideally, we'd like to work with 5, but right now 2 is all we can do. And my Northern Inupiaq panel was comprised of 2 amazing, just brilliant people who are linguists and well-respected and really, really superstars and amazing. And one of them had a snowmobiling accident, or is it snow machine in the lower 48 or snowmobile? Anyway, so a snow machine.
We don't have that in Phoenix.
Okay, so we call it snow machines. Accident, and it was really tragic. And a few weeks later, he passed away, and that was hard. I mean, you could feel it, through the language community, and in particular, the work for my panel at that point just kind of came to a halt. And so the question is now, how do we move on, honoring all the work that he did, not just with us, but through his entire life and career, and keeping that going. And so one of the things with the Inupiaq panel that is different from the Yupik panel and from the Gwich'in panel is that it's not under a settlement, right? And so it means I have a little bit more flexibility. And so we've reached out to some young speakers who participated in our language summit that we had in March, and who were very interested in continuing and who wanted to do it. And so we're beginning to work with them and the other panel members and try to develop a relationship that's intergenerational as well. And so taking opportunities like that and trying to work through changes that sometimes are difficult, like losing Mr. Nagyak, are really important to keep going.
I'm fortunate that I'm the only professor of Yupik, so I get to keep my kids from year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4. So they have me, I have them. So I see that I raise them at the university. I raise them as speakers and readers and writers of the Yupik language. I have one Latino from Northern California who just graduated last spring, who knows more Yupik and can emote in Yupik than he can ever in Spanish. Wow. And that's a lot to say about how much of a passion he had to make that decision to learn that. In fact, there's times, teasingly, he would correct me. and that says a lot about his devotion to learn the Yupik language. And he knows burrito and sombrero. I think that's about it. Gracias. And so, yeah, I take to heart the language that I teach because I'm looking for the tomorrow, because I don't want to see what happened to Mr. Arriaga. And so we, I have that pleasant opportunity to nurture these kids. In fact, I have one kid right now who's in his second year of Yupik. He's pursuing Yupik as a degree, who is now my junior faculty because he's that good. And I would love to see him become more involved so that he could do the kinds of things that I do, or even better, because with technology and stuff, that's one big thing that would really enhance our ability to see Yupik in a broader sense, using those things that I wasn't familiar with growing up. And so, and my students, they're there because their parents didn't have the opportunity to learn the language, or they were beaten out of the language. I'm one of those. I was beaten out. I was one of the last people to be beaten out of my language. But fortunately, my mother never went to school, and she's a monolingual. She died only speaking one language, and that was hers 3 years ago. And so it gives me pride, the fact that even though I was beaten, I won over the fact that, you know, no one's going to ever take my language away from me, because I could silently use it. And in 1980 was the first time that I officially learned to read and write my own language, because like many of yours languages, it's an oral tradition. And so reading and writing only happened in 1972 at the university. And so it's that young. And it's a challenge, and I'm sure Indra sees this all the time in her work with the Yupik people, because yes, there's a writing system in Yupik. And yes, there are students who are learning to read and write Yuhtun, which is the Yupik language. But how many in our communities have that access? In fact, I taught, just because I had the opportunity to go to a community, because they requested me, elders requested me to teach a reading and writing for 1 week. And it was really, really powerful, because it was like, for the first time ever, that they had this opportunity to see their written language. And the week went by overnight. And because they wanted more, they were hungry for more. And I hope I have that opportunity to go back to doing that, because it's such a need, and Indra knows this from working with these amazing people in the elections field. It's an old language, but even though it's an old language, we still have this balance of, you know, how much of it do we know, can we transfer into the American ways of seeing things, when we have these unconsciously agreed upon set of socio-linguistic and cultural rules that are so Yupik that sometimes cannot be conveyed into English. And how do we find that language by which to expand? And that's where Indra and me, we come out and try to make those things happen, so that we have a stronger language in both, so that we could use in both worlds.
As I said before, it's such important work, and I think the success stories of the students you described really says as much about their instructor as it does about the students. And I think the challenge is for all of us to really be thinking about what things can we be doing now to make this kind of work visible to young people, to get them interested and to involve them from early ages in the kind of community building work that is important. When I think back to my role as a voter outreach director almost 20 years ago, it kind of blows my mind. and working with our counties, especially our rural counties in Arizona, how much we depended upon a small handful of individuals really to be the human bridges between our work and the indigenous communities that we were seeking to reach out to. And it's a little disturbing for me to think about how in the late 90s, those people that I knew were already elderly. And when I was an undergraduate, I started out in linguistic anthropology. I got to tour indigenous communities in Mexico, and there were some that were so small, the entire community of language speakers was a few dozen people who were all elderly. And that was over 25 years ago. So it's likely that some of those languages no longer exist and some of those traditions no longer exist. So all of us should be thinking about what can we do to create the bridges and the pipelines to get young people, especially from these language communities, to see themselves as having important work to do, to be those human bridges, not just between language, but also culture and history. They're the ones that will really make or break the success of our efforts to provide that language access. So final question, and then we'll open up, is what can you think of that election officials and administrators could do that would make your work easier? Or what is something that is maybe a challenge for you that you wish you could overcome if you had a magic wand?
Just one? I think that having the right tools and resources is so important. Travel in Alaska is difficult, it's costly, it's unpredictable, but it's necessary. And the more that we go out, the better the relationships are. I mean, I was just in Nunivak Island, which is in the Bering Sea, off of the Western Alaska. It took me an extra day to come and go because, flights getting delayed, and we would get in these little planes and we'd fly around, and then there was fog, so we'd come back and I'd wait another afternoon and try again. And but once I was there, it was a world of difference. Not just because I was working with the translators there and the people there, but it gave me a better understanding. And I think it's a two-way street. Like you have to understand your communities, but your communities have to understand you. And one of the things that we did in the spring was the language summit, and that was as much for the tribal folks who went, the translators who went, the partners, the voters, but it was also for us, because as a division, we needed to make that connection back with our communities, which kind of had gotten a little lost in decades of administration tasks, of making sure that the forms are coded correctly and making sure that we meet the deadlines, and all those things are really important to the process, but they can also give us tunnel vision. And so I think that if I could do one thing, is just make the transparency and the communication just flow like a river. I would love that.
We're talking about language and language access, and the other language access we don't talk about much is, what the language of the ballot, or the language of the instruments by which to make the choices. And in Alaska, they come in boxes, and that go from that are sent out to different villages, and those things are daunting because they're in tubs or crates, and so they come in as American objects. And so how do I make sense of these things, because they in and of itself, that they came on the plane, they don't belong to us, because even if it's an instrument or instruments inside the box, it's still not my community's. How do we make sense of that, so that when people say, instead of saying, whoa, I'm not picking this up because it belongs to the Division of Elections, how do we make that language to where they say, oh, these instruments are here for us, here's our gift from, so that we can make choices. How do we come to that space to where we as Indigenous people accept that, saying, wow, here's our opportunity. And I think Indra said, the more we make conversation with the communities who facilitate these things, and so that every instrument, every pen, every paper, every curtain has a connection to the poll workers. The poll workers then define that as the community, so that when this box comes, everybody is ready to vote when it's voting time.
I think we have time for one question. Do we have
Just
a question?
one.
In the back, yes.
One of the points you both seem to be making is that it matters quite a bit who you interact with in these communities, and what kind of leaders you interact with, and how you get community buy-in so that people can want to engage in the voting process. And obviously this is something that's come up in several of the panels. Can you talk a little bit about how you identify the right people, and kind of some things that you've learned over time, and how to best engage communities, and what the wrong way is? And it may be that you don't want to engage political people, but you want to engage community elders or things like that. Thank you.
I'm going to have Indra answer that, because as an outsider insider, okay, because she's from the outside inside. She's our sister now, but it took her a while to get to that space, and so I want her to answer that.
Mostly I just ask Walkie. No, so, the first time I came to Alaska, I was working for the state under a different division, and I had to make all these calls to communities, and I had no idea how to pronounce them. So I relied on what little I know of Nahuatl, which actually is nothing like it. And so, for example, the TL combination in Nahuatl is Tla, right? But in Yupik, it isn't Tla. It's it's different. And so I would call these communities, and the people on the other end would laugh, and I would just laugh along with them, because I knew I didn't know. And so starting with being open to those experiences, I think, is important, but also, like, more formally, we contact the tribes. Our first point of contact is usually the tribe, and say, this is what we're trying to do. We're doing it by law. We have these materials that we want to bring in. We need translators. Who do you recommend? Because my section is 2 people. Jim speaks Yupik. He's Yupik. I don't, but we don't only cover Yupik. We cover several Athabascan languages, and Alutiiq, and Spanish, and Tagalog, and Siberian Yupik, Koyukon, and Gwich'in, and Inupiaq. And so I have to rely on, firstly, the communities, of asking them, and usually they'll tell you, oh, well, so-and-so is a teacher, and she writes and she reads, or he writes and he reads, and we think they'll be really good. For the settlement languages, we bring together panels, and some of those recommendations came from NARF, and so we just went down the list, and we called folks, some at the university, some at the community, some with tribes, some teachers, and as people became available, they became part of our resources. And so just really, like right now, we're adding a new dialect in Yupik to Upper Nashagak, which is the river above in Bristol Bay, so it's 3 communities up there. And we couldn't find anybody. So we asked panel members themselves, right? And we called the tribe, and it's just a lot of asking. You just have to really ask, and if I ask 5 people, and 4 of them mention one person, chances are that person is the right person, right? But you just have to just keep asking.
We have about 90 seconds left, so let me ask, Walkie, do you have any final thoughts you would like to leave us with?
Well, I think the more we make common this thing called voting, or dudukliarak, to our communities, that this is going to define the way that we live. And if we could share that information, say, I know this is kind of a different way selecting a leader, but once, I guess if we could recontextualize the language, which all of you have done, and all of you do in many great and amazing ways, to continue doing that and make just giving this thing called voting some life. Saying, you know, this is our future, and this is the and I think if we could even making the word vote, connecting it with a story of how, remember how we selected chief so and so. Well, it's the same process, but this is using paper, and so I think the more they make sense of new stuff, the stronger the direction for making choices.
Thank you. And I think I'll just close this fireside chat by saying the intention was not to provide specific answers and strategies as much as to help, I think, all of us start thinking about what are the important questions we need to be asking that will help us learn what we need to learn to do this work effectively and to build and maintain the relationships we need with these communities that will sustain this work in the long term. So I hope this has been thought-provoking and generative for you as it has been for me. And please help me thank my panelists, Indra Arriaga and Dr. Charles Waukee. Waukee Charles.